He was young, handsome, and full of life, just 23 when he married a woman more than twice his age. 2 days later, he was dead, strangled, and left to die in the very home where he thought he'd found security. But behind the southern charm and candlelit vows was a plan darker than anything love could explain. To manipulate love for control, to exploit trust for power, and to end a life for selfish gain, there is no excuse. These actions are wicked, calculated, and beyond redemption. This is true crime's altar, where sins are laid bare, the guilty find no hiding place, and every crime is a sermon in blood. Subscribe, share, and comment, because the truth deserves to be known. Eaton Hollow, Alabama, nestled beneath a canopy of moss-covered oaks, was a town where the air smelled of gardenias and Sundays still meant church, potluck, and polite conversation. With just over 4,000 people, it was the sort of place where your mailman knew your birthday and the cashier at the corner store asked about your mama. For as long as anyone could remember, Lenora Whitfield had been Eaton Hollow's most elusive resident. At 55, she was statuesque and quietly regal, her presence always composed yet distant. Her late husband, Clifton Whitfield, had been a powerhouse in local real estate, owning businesses and land from one side of the county to the other. His sudden, unexplained death 5 years earlier had left Lenora not only widowed, but immensely wealthy. Whispers about Clifton's demise never truly faded. Some believed his death was no accident, that Lenora knew more than she ever let on. But no one dared confront her. In a town where legacy spoke louder than facts, Lenora's influence bought her silence. Life in Eaton Hollow hummed along predictably, until it didn't. The woman who had spent years behind drawn curtains stunned the town with a marriage announcement. She was marrying a man 32 years her junior. Kendrick Myers was a fresh face in town, arriving the year before from Mobile. At 23, he was charismatic, smooth-talking, and undeniably attractive, tall with a natural athleticism and a smile that made the church girls giggle. Many had noticed him, but it wasn't one of Eaton Hollow's single daughters who had caught his attention. It was the reclusive widow, Lenora. Their courtship was the talk of every hair salon, cafe booth, and choir practice. What could Kendrick possibly want with a woman his mother's age? Some said it was the money. Others believed Lenora, isolated and lonely, had fallen for the illusion of love. Either way, tongues wagged, and speculation turned to shock when Lenora announced they were engaged. The wedding was held at All Saints Chapel, the town's most distinguished church. Nearly everyone showed up, not to celebrate, but to witness the spectacle. Lenora wore a flowing ivory dress, understated but expensive. Kendrick, in a sleek navy suit, looked more like a nervous usher than a groom. Vows were exchanged, photos taken, cake cut, yet beneath the polished ceremony was a quiet unease. As Kendrick said, "I do," many whispered that the marriage wouldn't see the month through. They were almost right. Just 2 days later, on the morning of August 14th, Eaton Hollow woke to unthinkable news. Kendrick Myers was dead. His body was discovered inside the Whitfield estate on the northern edge of town, sprawling across 5 acres of manicured lawn and brick pathways. It was the housekeeper, arriving early to prepare breakfast, who found him. He had been strangled. His body bore the marks of a brutal struggle, bruises across his arms and chest, cuts on his hands. His face, frozen in a look of pure terror. He had fought desperately and lost. The housekeeper's screams shattered the morning quiet, drawing neighbors from their porches to the estate gates. By the time Sheriff Eldon Pratt arrived, a crowd had gathered. Pratt, a seasoned lawman in his late 40s, had seen his share of violence, but this scene struck him differently. Something felt too quiet. Inside the estate, sunlight filtered through the grand windows, casting warm light on antique furniture and gleaming hardwood floors. Breakfast had been set. Nothing looked out of place, except for the fact that a young man had been murdered in his sleep. Kendrick's lifeless body lay on the master bed. Deep bruises around his neck told the story of how he died. Defensive wounds suggested he hadn't gone easily. There was no broken glass, no signs of forced entry, no sign that anyone had come from outside. It had to be someone he knew. Someone he trusted. Lenora was found at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a porcelain teacup, her face pale but calm. Too calm. She told the sheriff she hadn't heard anything during the night. She had slept in the guest bedroom, she said. Kendrick had gone to bed early. She didn't want to disturb him. Pratt watched her carefully. She answered every question without hesitation. Too neatly. Her tone was measured, her gaze steady. She insisted she had no knowledge of what had happened. But something was off. How could she have slept through such a violent attack? Why hadn't she heard the struggle? And why, in the face of her husband's violent death, was she so composed? Suspicion settled in the room, like dust in sunlight. When a heart turns cold enough to lie through grief, it does not weep, it calculates. And in the presence of murder, silence can be the loudest confession of all. As word of Kendrick's death spread, the town buzzed. Some said Lenora had grown tired of her boy husband. Others believed Kendrick's past had finally caught up with him. Still more wondered if this was Eaton Hollow's darkest secret unraveling at last. Sheriff Pratt wasn't interested in speculation. He had a murder to solve. The charming southern town was now a maze of whispers, secrets, and suspicion. As he stared down at Kendrick's body, the promise he made to himself was simple. He would find the truth, even if it meant tearing apart everything Eaton Hollow pretended to be. The morning after Kendrick Meyer's body was found, Eaton Hollow stirred under a cloud of suspicion. At Sweet Hazel's Cafe, whispers passed over steaming mugs of chicory coffee. At Mount Hill Baptist, pews creaked with gossip cloaked as prayer. But Sheriff Eldon Pratt didn't have time for talk. He had work to do. The Whitfield estate was cordoned off by mid-morning. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, sectioning off the pristine grounds like a crime scene drawn on lace. Pratt and his small team combed through every inch of the property, from the sunroom to the basement. It was an eerie operation, the house itself nearly spotless, as though someone had taken great care to wipe away the evidence. The master bedroom showed signs of the struggle, but not much else. No fingerprints, no broken windows, no forced entry. The windows were latched tight. The only marks of violence were on Kendrick's bruised body and the tangled bedsheets beneath him. Sheriff Pratt's first stop was Lenora Whitfield. Again. She was back in the kitchen. Same table, same cup. Only this time, there were dark circles beneath her eyes, carefully disguised with makeup, but visible to a trained observer. Still, her posture was unbending, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Whitfield," Pratt said, pulling out the chair across from her. "We need to go over some details again." "I've told you everything I remember, Sheriff," she replied calmly, folding her hands in her lap. "You said you slept in the guest room, that Kendrick went to bed early and you didn't want to disturb him." "Yes." "And you didn't hear a thing? No noise? No struggle?" She paused just a moment too long. "I sleep heavily. Always have." Pratt narrowed his eyes. "Your husband's body shows signs of a fight. A bad one. That doesn't happen quietly." Lenora's gaze drifted to the edge of her cup, her fingers tracing it with gentle precision. "If I could tell you more, I would." Her voice was flat. Her answers felt processed. And yet, nothing linked her to the crime, not directly. No blood, no prints, no confession. But the sheriff's instincts weren't fooled. There was a fracture beneath her polished surface. After leaving the house, Pratt turned his attention to Kendrick's background. His team dug into the young man's life before Eaton Hollow. Born in Mobile, Kendrick had come up hard, scraping by on odd jobs and keeping company with some questionable folks. By the time he turned 18, he was doing construction work and bouncing around rental homes. His move to Eaton Hollow had seemed like a fresh start. But now, it looked more like an escape. Financial records revealed a string of debts and mobile, significant ones. Payday lenders, car notes, private creditors. And these weren't the patient kind. Some of the names linked to Kendrick's debts were the kind people whispered about in fear, not business. When desperation meets opportunity, it doesn't ask questions, it just takes. And sometimes that kind of hunger walks willingly into danger wearing a smile. For a brief time, Kendrick's life appeared to stabilize after meeting Lenora, a rich widow, a sprawling estate, a quiet town. On paper, it looked like the fairy tale ending to a troubled youth. But as Pratt's officers traced phone records, a new name emerged, one that hadn't come up before. Sienna Blake. According to the call logs, Kendrick had been in regular contact with her in the weeks leading up to his death. Sienna, it turned out, was Kendrick's ex-girlfriend from Mobile. They had been close for years, even lived together briefly before Kendrick up and left. Pratt tracked her down in Montgomery. When he called, she was hesitant, but eventually agreed to meet. 2 days later, they sat in a diner off the interstate, across from a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. Sienna, in her mid-20s, was poised but visibly uneasy. "I don't know what this has to do with me," she said, stirring her tea. "I haven't seen Kendrick since he left for Eaton Hollow." Pratt slid a sheet of paper across the table. "You two talked often. These calls go up to a day before he died." Sienna's hand stilled. She glanced at the sheet. "He called me. I never called him." "Why?" "He was scared," she said after a pause. "Said he'd gotten in too deep with someone. Wouldn't say who. He was always like that. Thought if he didn't say it out loud, it wasn't real." "Did he mention Lenora?" Sienna shook her head. "Only that she treated him well. But I could tell something was off. He kept talking about needing to fix things. Said he'd made a mistake." Her eyes welled, but she blinked quickly. "He was trying to get out, I think. Out of something. I didn't push him. Kendrick didn't like being cornered." Pratt leaned back in his seat, watching her. "Do you think he was in danger?" She looked him in the eye, voice firm. "Yes. Kendrick always flirted with trouble, but this time it was following him." The meeting left Pratt with more questions than answers. Why had Kendrick kept calling his ex while living in luxury with Lenora? Why stay in a marriage if he was planning to leave? And most of all, who else knew? Back in Eaton Hollow, Pratt called his deputies together. Check if Kendrick had any other contacts here, anyone he trusted, anyone who might have known about his money troubles. They dug deep, and what they began to uncover was troubling. The debts, the rushed wedding, the secret contact with Sienna. A man running out of options, clinging to solutions that only trapped him deeper. The narrative was shifting. Public opinion in town turned fast. At Kendrick's funeral, Lenora stood alone, dignified but cold. There were no tears, no trembling voice. Her calm became its own scandal. The whispers grew. She'd done it to avoid being used. That Kendrick had served his purpose. That maybe she hadn't loved him at all. Sheriff Pratt wasn't convinced by rumor, but as he reviewed the evidence, one thing became clear. Lenora Whitfield wasn't the grieving widow she pretended to be. And Kendrick Myers? He wasn't just a victim. He was a man caught in a game he didn't understand and never had a chance of winning. When a life is bought, not built, when love is currency and control the reward, what begins with seduction often ends in suffocation, and sometimes that end comes long before the heart stops beating. Sheriff Eldon Pratt had worked his share of strange cases in Eden Hollow, but nothing came close to this. Kendrick Meyer's murder was no longer looking like a crime of passion. It was starting to feel like a trap, one set long before he ever said, "I do." The Whitfield estate, once the jewel of Eden Hollow, had become something else entirely. Neighbors who once envied Lenora now avoided eye contact with her at the post office. Her composed silence, once seen as grace, now felt like a mask. And masks always crack. The first break came when the forensic team noticed something strange in the guest room, where Lenora claimed she'd been sleeping the night Kendrick was killed. On the inside of the window frame, nearly invisible without special light, were faint specks of blood. Not enough to suggest a crime occurred there, but enough to cast doubt on her story. Then came something bigger. While reviewing Lenora's financial records, one name came up repeatedly: Solomon Cray, a local developer with a polished image and a reputation for backdoor deals. Cray had been a business associate of Lenora's late husband, Clifton Whitfield, before his sudden drowning years earlier. In fact, Cray had been the last person seen with Clifton the night he died. It had always seemed suspicious, but there were no witnesses, and Cray claimed he had left early while Clifton stayed out boating alone. With no body recovered until the next day and no evidence of foul play, the case was closed. Now, Sheriff Pratt's instincts were screaming. When he started asking questions, he learned Cray had been seen at the Whitfield estate numerous times in recent months. When confronted, Cray gave a smooth answer. He was negotiating to buy a few properties Lenora still owned. Just business, he claimed, but the sheriff wasn't buying it. Something about the timing was off. Why suddenly reconnect now? And why was Cray sending money to Kendrick? Because that's exactly what Pratt's team discovered next. Bank statements showed a pattern: small, frequent transfers from one of Cray's shell companies to an account Kendrick had kept hidden. The transactions went back nearly 6 months. It wasn't just support. It looked like control. There are strings some men pull behind closed doors, invisible, delicate, and cruel. And when you trace them to their source, you often find a hand soaked in someone else's blood. Pratt's new theory took shape quickly. Kendrick hadn't married Lenora for love. He'd been pushed, paid. Cray, always calculating, had likely offered him an escape from his debts, but at a price. The question now was, what was the real plan? Why marry Lenora? What was Cray playing at? Deputy Celeste Mallory, reviewing archived files on Clifton Whitfield's death, found something everyone else had missed: an old police report from the night of the drowning. Clifton and Solomon Cray had gone out on the river together. Cray claimed they returned, but Clifton wanted to stay out longer and finish a drink. Cray said he left him there. But the report noted something strange. Cray had wet cuffs and torn skin on his right hand. He claimed he had slipped stepping out of the boat. At the time, no one pressed him. There was no proof of wrongdoing. But now, paired with his connection to Kendrick and the hidden money, it all looked far more sinister. Sheriff Pratt circled back to Lenora. This time, she looked different, tired, frayed, her famously flawless hair beginning to gray at the roots. She sat in her drawing room, eyes distant, fingers twisting a ring that no longer fit tightly on her hand. "Mrs. Whitfield," Pratt began, "we found blood in the guest room. Just a trace. And we found records showing Mr. Cray's been making payments to Kendrick. You told me you didn't know anything. I need you to be honest with me now." Lenora's lips parted, but she didn't speak right away. Finally, she said, "Solomon's helped me with the business since Clifton passed. He's always been around. But money to Kendrick? I didn't know anything about that." "Did you know Solomon had financial control over some of your husband's properties?" Pratt asked. She looked startled. "No, Clifton never said that." "You think Solomon might have used Kendrick? Maybe even manipulated him into marrying you?" Her fingers tightened. "I wouldn't have needed convincing. I liked Kendrick. He made me feel She stopped herself, eyes glazing. Alive again. There was pain in her voice, but something else too. A shadow of guilt. Pratt leaned forward. If Solomon was controlling Kendrick, what do you think he'd do if Kendrick decided to walk away? She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered, Solomon always said loyalty mattered more than truth. Back at the sheriff's office, Pratt reviewed everything they had. The mysterious transfers, the blood specks, the old boating report. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but one still missing a central piece. He needed to know what Kendrick had been thinking in those final days. So he turned again to Sienna Blake. This time, she was less guarded. Kendrick said he was done, she admitted. He told me he couldn't keep pretending. Said the money wasn't worth it anymore. He felt like a pet, like someone else was pulling the strings. Did he say who? Pratt asked. Sienna hesitated. He said the name Solomon once. Said he owed him. But then he told me to forget it. Did he say anything about leaving Eaton Hollow? Tears threatened her voice. He was making a plan. He said he had to get out before things got worse. But I think he waited too long. Some chains are forged in silence, quiet agreements, dirty favors, whispered threats. And by the time you realize how tight they've become, it's already too late to break free. Sheriff Pratt walked out of the cafe with a heaviness pressing on his shoulders. He knew now Kendrick had been trapped in a dangerous game, one he'd tried to exit too late. Solomon Cray was the architect. But whether Lenora was a pawn or an accomplice remained unclear. The clock was ticking. Truths buried deep in Eaton Hollow's soil were rising to the surface, and Sheriff Pratt intended to dig every last one of them up. Sheriff Eldon Pratt was closing in on Solomon Cray, and the closer he got, the darker the web became. Kendrick Meyer's murder no longer looked like a failed romance or an impulsive act. It was deliberate, calculated, and beneath it all lay the question no one had dared ask aloud. Was this the second man Cray had orchestrated out of the picture? Because if Clifton Whitfield's death hadn't been an accident, then this wasn't Cray's first time pulling strings until someone snapped. When Pratt called Cray back in for questioning, the man showed up in a crisp blazer and polished loafers, flashing the same easy smile he always wore at ribbon cuttings and business luncheons. But the sheriff wasn't here to be charmed. Let's talk about Lenora Whitfield, Pratt began, his voice flat, the fluorescence above throwing harsh shadows across Cray's smooth face. Old friend. She's been through a lot. I've tried to help, Cray replied coolly. Pratt didn't blink. You call funneling money into Kendrick Meyer's account help? For the first time, Cray's expression flickered. Kendrick was in trouble. I gave him a few advances. Kid needed it. You think that's a crime? Not the giving. The reason. Why were you paying him? To keep him in line? To keep him married to Lenora? Cray leaned back, arms crossed. You've got quite the imagination, Sheriff. No, Pratt said, voice sharpening. I've got evidence. Records. Witnesses. A trail of manipulation long enough to strangle someone with. And if Kendrick tried to pull away, you had motive to silence him. Cray's jaw clenched, but he kept quiet. You were the last person to see Clifton Whitfield alive. And now Kendrick's dead after months of payments from you. Seems like everyone you get close to ends up in the river or a coffin. That's when Cray stood up. If you had proof, I wouldn't be sitting here, he snapped. I helped Kendrick. That's all. He got into something in Mobile, and I pulled him out. If he was planning to leave Lenora, I didn't know. Maybe you should look at her a little closer. When a man speaks with the calm of a serpent, never mistake it for innocence. Some lies are so smooth, they sound like concern. Before Pratt could press further, Deputy Mallory burst into the room with a file in hand and urgency on her face. She leaned in and whispered, "You'll want to see this." Outside the interrogation room, Pratt flipped open the folder. Inside were grainy surveillance stills. Two figures, Kendrick Myers and Sienna Blake. Together. Not just talking, not just catching up. They were meeting often in secluded spots, late at night, intimate body language, quiet embraces. So their relationship hadn't ended. And Sienna had lied about that. Back inside, Pratt decided to shift his focus. He left Cray stewing and headed straight to Montgomery. Sienna opened the door already pale, as if she knew what was coming. "I didn't kill him," she said before he could speak. "No one said you did," Pratt replied, stepping inside. "But you lied to me. You said you hadn't seen Kendrick in months. That's not true." She sank under the edge of her couch. I didn't want to ruin his image. Or mine." Pratt sat across from her. "I've seen the photos. You were still seeing each other right up to the end." She nodded slowly. "We never really stopped. He said the marriage wasn't real, that it was a way to fix things. But he couldn't stay much longer. He was planning to leave. We were going to run." "Did Lenora know?" "No. He didn't want to hurt her. Said she'd already lost too much." Pratt studied her face. And Cray. That name made her stiffen. Kendrick was terrified of him. Said Solomon had something over Lenora. Something about Clifton's death. But Kendrick didn't have proof. He just wanted out. When fear becomes routine, when love is lived in the shadows, freedom becomes a dream that some never reach, because every step toward the light risks being silenced by darkness. Back in Eaton Hollow, Pratt reviewed everything again. The blood on the window, the payments, the affair, Cray's smirking denial, Lenora's growing detachment. And then another moment of clarity. Kendrick's phone had a deleted voice memo, barely recovered by the tech team. The audio was scratchy, but the voice was unmistakable. "I can't do this anymore. Cray's pulling strings I never agreed to. He wants me in this marriage, says it's the only way to keep the money flowing, to protect me from Mobile. But it's a cage. I'm trying to leave. If anything happens, he did it." That was enough. Pratt brought Sienna and Lenora in, together. It was time for truth. They sat across from each other, strangers bound by a single man's death. Lenora was composed, but her eyes shimmered with something unspoken. Sienna looked defensive, but broken. "I know you were seeing him," Lenora said softly. "I knew before the wedding." Sienna's mouth opened in shock. "I thought if I gave him everything, safety, comfort, a future, he'd stay," Lenora whispered. But he never stopped looking back. "Did you kill him?" Sienna asked, trembling. "No," she said. "But I knew something was coming. Kendrick was afraid. I saw it in his eyes." Pratt stepped in. "It wasn't either of you. It was Solomon Cray." Kendrick tried to pull away, and Cray couldn't let him go. He'd invested too much. He wasn't going to let the game fall apart. Lenora finally cracked. "Cray controlled everything. Even me. After Clifton died, he moved in. Helped me with the estate. But I never knew what it cost." "Now you do," Pratt said. "And it's time to bring it to light."
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
The next morning, Solomon Cray was arrested at his office on charges of conspiracy and first-degree murder. The press swarmed. Eaton Hollow watched from behind curtains as the man they once toasted at charity galas was led away in handcuffs. He didn't smile this time. The investigation revealed everything: his payments to Kendrick, his financial control over Lenora, and evidence linking him to Clifton's death years earlier. The river hadn't washed away the truth. It had only delayed it. Control born of fear is never love. It is a quiet cruelty, masked by gifts and held in place by threats. And those who enforce it do so until blood becomes the price. Kendrick Myers was gone, used, cornered, then discarded. But in his final acts, he left behind enough to expose the machinery that chewed him up. Lenora Whitfield was left to rebuild a life she never truly owned. Her silence had been her prison, but in the end, it became a key. Sienna Blake, forever marked by love and loss, returned home with a heart broken but a conscience clear. And Sheriff Eldon Pratt stood outside the courthouse as Cray was loaded into a van, knowing justice had come, late but righteous. But justice never heals. It only ends the story. Sheriff Eldon Pratt had seen the case to its bitter end. Solomon Cray was indicted not only for the murder of Kendrick Myers, but also for the suspicious death of Clifton Whitfield 5 years prior. Financial manipulation, coercion, and calculated violence. Cray's empire had finally collapsed under the weight of its secrets. The courtroom was packed the day the verdict came down. Cray sat motionless as the jury found him guilty on all counts. There were no outbursts, no pleas, just silence, the kind that follows the fall of a man who once believed himself untouchable. Lenora Whitfield did not attend the trial's final day. She had withdrawn from public life, selling off the estate, donating much of her wealth, and relocating quietly out of state. Those who had once envied her now pitied her. In the end, she had been a queen in a gilded cage, blinded by loyalty, frozen by fear. Sienna Blake quietly left town, too. She visited Kendrick's grave one last time before disappearing into a life of anonymity. Her love had not been enough to save him, but it had been true, and now it was her burden to carry alone. As for Eaton Hollow, the town resumed its slow rhythm, but it would never be the same. The story of Kendrick Myers became a cautionary tale, spoken of in hushed tones at Sunday suppers and whispered warnings to the young and vulnerable. Because when power disguises itself as love and silence replaces truth, the heart becomes its own prison. And in that prison, many suffer, but only few ever escape. Let this story serve as more than just a grim tale. It should be a warning. If you or someone you love is in a relationship where fear outweighs affection, where control masquerades as care, do not wait for the storm to pass. Speak up. Reach out. Ask for help. Go to someone you trust, a counselor, a relative, a law enforcement officer. You are not alone, and you do not have to endure in silence. No one deserves to live in fear, and no one should die because they tried to break free. This has been True Crimes Altar, where sins are laid bare, the guilty find no hiding place, and every crime is a sermon in blood. If you were moved by this story, we want to hear from you. Comment your thoughts below. What do you think Kendrick could have done differently? Do you believe Lenora was a victim or an accomplice? And tell us where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe, share this video, and click the notification bell so you never miss another true crime that reveals what lies beneath the surface. Until next time, stay safe, speak truth, and never let love blind you to danger.